everybody. Welcome to today's live chat. So, if you don't know me, I'm Troy Dunniway, and I'm the game design mentor, teacher, and department head at CG Spectrum. In today's talk, we're going to talk about producing games. So each week now, we're going to choose kind of a variety of different topics that are related to game design or directly are game design related, but really about game production, kind of in general. And so today I thought we'd talk about what it's like to be a producer. Now, as a producer, it's an interesting job because it interrelates to and interacts with every single department on the entire team. And so I'm going to try and talk today a lot about sort of not only just the job and the role and sort of being a producer, but I know that a lot of you guys are artists and, designers or engineers or other people, that aren't necessarily looking to become a designer. But I want you to kind of understand, you're not a producer or looking to become a producer, but I want you to understand that, as a producer, because you have to work with all these different team members that you, if you're one of those team members, even if you never dream of becoming a producer, the more that you kind of understand what the producer's job is, the better you're going to be able to work with them. And I think that's a really important part of our jobs is that in most teams and most companies, day in and day out, and sometimes 5 times a day, you have to interact with a producer. And so I don't care whether you're an artist, a programmer, designer, whatever you are, that those people have to, you have to interact with each other, and work with each other, right? And so the game producers are, that person that you're going to interact the most with, especially when it comes to scheduling and stuff like that. But even beyond schedule, there's still a lot of stuff that you, as a, somebody who makes video games, like I said, whether you're a designer, producer, whatever, you all have to work together as a team, right? And so we're talking about just kind of this role as a producer. And so I'm stalling a few minutes trying to let more people kind of log in here. But let's start to talk a little bit about the different roles of producers on a team and kind of the different types of producers you're going to encounter. And then we'll get into, what they, more specifically kind of what they do and in their job roles. And again, then how can you, as an artist or engineer or designer, how can you work with producers to make make your job better, right? Because again, these are people that you're going to have to interact with, every day, many different times a day in many different levels. First of all, to talk about producers on a video game team, this is a difficult subject because, in all honesty, while there is some standards and there's some things that are kind of the same, it really does vary tremendously from company to company, team to team, project to project, even just as far as what does a game producer do, and then exactly, where does their roles kind of start and stop. And so this will definitely change significantly on larger teams. So the larger the team typically is, the more specialized a producer might become. And then on smaller teams, they become definitely much more of a jack of all trades. And at some levels, kind of the one way to think about game producers is they're that person who, one, is kind of the glue that keeps the team together. They're the person who's, is going to make sure that everybody's having meetings. They're making sure everything's getting done. They're making sure about all these dependencies and codependencies, and all that sort of stuff are things that they're doing. And so they're kind of that grease in that machine as well. That's going to like keep that big giant, game development machine going, which could be a dozen people. It could be thousands of people. Right. But the producers are those ones that are managing communication. They're managing, the day ins and day outs and the second to second of everything that everybody's doing and making sure everybody's getting along. And so again, the job or the role of producer, if that's something you do ever want to consider, can be varied, right? A lot of departments have their own producers. So at a lot of especially bigger teams, you'd have like an art producer, an engineering producer, or design producer versus just project producers. So even, individual teams can have their own producers. And so, but they're also, besides kind of being that grease that keeps the engine moving and that glue that kind of keeps the team together, they're also sort of that jack of all trades, that person that does everything. And they're the kind of person that does every other job that nobody else wants to do, And I used to joke with my team members a lot about when I was a producer that it was also, if it took me taking out the trash and getting coffee for everybody, even if I was an executive producer, the top guy, so to speak, that's what I had to do, and that's what you did do as a producer to make your team happy, to keep them, motivated and working and stuff. And so, so a producer really is kind of that catch-all bucket title that really kind of just does everything that nobody else wants to do. And if you've never been on a game production team or been on a movie production team outside of maybe just your limited scope, what you don't always realize or remember or know is that, there is a million things that every game, especially in movies, are the same way, that have to be done that quite often we're never totally aware of. There's a lot of stuff that, for example, in legal, that, we're never aware of all the stuff, the contracts and things that are going back and forth, there, who's interfacing with sales and marketing. All these things are areas that like the average team member would never, ever, ever have any knowledge of, really. And only maybe the producers and a couple other people, have that kind of knowledge. And so it's important for you to sort of understand, that a producer's job role can change, again, a lot, as we talk about kind of the titles a little bit. So first of all, let's start off, talking about, what some of these different job titles are, job roles are. So the top of the pyramid, so to speak, at most companies is what they call an executive producer, or EP for short. And so the executive producer is often somebody who is overseeing kind of multiple games, multiple titles, multiple things all simultaneously. Occasionally, they might be just having a single franchise or a single game or something like that. But more often than not, at larger companies, an executive producer is quite often over like an entire franchise or something, which could include multiple projects or multiple teams and things like that. And so they tend to be kind of the mile high executive that's overseeing the grand vision of the project, the grand vision of scope and scale and budget. And they're working on quite often managing up, meaning they're the ones who are dealing the most with potentially the executive teams. They're also potentially ones dealing with like the press, and they're generally people that are pretty knowledgeable and experienced in the industry, where they're maybe off doing press interviews and, and stuff like that. And so they're wearing a different level of hats, but they quite often, especially at larger companies, are somebody who is a little bit detached from the product and from the project itself, maybe from a day-to-day perspective. But it doesn't mean that they're not working on it, but they may have a million other things that they're also working on. And so they're not necessarily as close to the actual project there. But it also depends on, some teams have what we call a project director, which often can also be called a creative director. And that project director or creative director is sometimes an equal to the executive producer, and depending on the company, the executive producer could be above or below that person. And so I've seen both things done there, where since an executive producer is more about budget and things like that some people put him in charge or her in charge, as an EP to kind of manage it top down, whereas other companies have kind of recognized that creative should be in charge. And so the project directors are typically a creative director who is a game designer. And by putting them in charge, they usually are maybe not as savvy about budgets and scope and scale and that type of stuff. And so that's recognizing that the projects need to be run more creatively versus more, on the production side. So again, the executive producer is handling a lot of varied tasks, maybe even overseeing pipelines and processes and just making sure that overall the team is happy, running well, and making high-level decisions, about stuff. Now, the next job role under that is what's called a senior producer. And a senior producer is somebody who's also doing often some similar things to an executive producer. but with maybe less scope, less responsibility. They're usually focused on a single project. It doesn't mean they can't be on 2 or 3, but typically, more often than not, they're kind of that person who's leading the day-to-day of the process of a game, in that kind of a production environment, for a team for that day, right? So they may be, whereas a executive producer might be just saying, hey, every 3 months we have to have a milestone, and we're going to have things, kind of just roughly laid out, in a big scale. A senior producer might be like, okay, here's what we need to get done every week, and something like that. Whereas other people may be working on what we need to do today versus what do we need to do this hour, right? And so the scope of responsibility for a senior producer and what they are looking at is usually a little bit smaller in scale than like a executive producer. They're also quite often the ones who are handling a lot of the just kind of internal, mundane, day-to-day, things that need to happen to keep it moving forward, that aren't in a level that an executive producer needs to worry about. But in some smaller teams, they may not even have a senior producer. They may just have an executive producer and a producer. So there is times where that senior producer role is kind of forgotten about. But again, they're jack of all trades. Now, as a dotted line kind of side to this, I'll also mention briefly about one of the main responsibilities that we'll talk about for being a game producer is scheduling. And that's quite often for a lot of companies and for a lot of roles, especially the senior producer and producers are the people who are kind of handling a significant amount of the scheduling. But again, the producer is this person that can do a million different things, and scheduling is one of those. It might be a big part of those, but a producer's real skill and talents lie in the fact that they have a lot of knowledge about everything. They're the ultimate consummate jack of all trades, right? And so, so that being said, when you are, a producer or senior producer or whatever, you might be so busy in doing all that other stuff that doing the schedules may just overwhelm you. And so some teams have recognized that. They've also recognized that there's kind of two disciplines. Scheduling is kind of its own thing that's hard to do and really is its own art form. And then that sort of person that does everything else is also kind of, valuable. And so at companies like EA and bigger companies, they've actually split that role into two. And now they have what they call a whatever level of producer. So you have a producer. It doesn't matter whether you're just a regular producer, senior producer, whatever. You have a producer role, and you have what's called now a development director role. The development director role is just a pure scheduling role only. And so these development directors, or DDs as we call them, their whole job is just to schedule. They don't do anything else. They're 24/7 in the schedule, and they're the ones usually, again, working with the team, either directly by the hour or however the tools and the processes work. So these DDs are really, we jokingly call them schedule monkeys. And, it's, but they're the ones that are kind of keeping us on point and on task. And again, depending on the scope and scale of a project, there could be one DD, or there could be, one for each department, or there could be, multiple DDs all handling different aspects of the schedules. And then, worrying about all the, again, codependencies and stuff. And so you might even have potentially a senior DD or a lead DD or somebody who's managing the whole DD department. And that person is going to be responsible for making sure that all the schedules, all the interdepartmental schedules, and all the dependent schedules are working well together. So, and then under that you have, so under senior producers are just normal producers. These are typically kind of semi-junior to semi-experienced, people that, again, work on a lot of different things. Under them are associate producers, or APs, and they are usually the entry-level role. And then occasionally you'll see an assistant producer or AP there as well. The assistant being more of an intern or somebody who's very, very junior, with the associate being somebody with a few years experience. And depending on the company, the APs generally are quite often doing a little bit more of the grunt work, and they're often the people that are scheduling kind of to the hour, and they're the ones maybe working with each team member. They may be walking around the pits every day, or going office to office, or on email, or whatever the tools and the process is. They're going to be the ones who are sitting there, trying to figure out, the schedules, and keep everybody on track and keep the schedules updated and stuff, at the low level. And so again, that's in sharp contrast to, say, an executive producer who's only worried about, like, well, what's the schedule going to be like over the next, year or 2 years, and what's the overall schedule like? And so it just depends on, again, the teams. And again, the bigger the teams, the more people they are. So in short, that's kind of the different jobs as producers that are in the core producer realm. Now, that being said, again, there's a lot of subspecialties, where each department could have a different type of producer. Quite often, you'll see those maybe in audio. You might see what we call a loc producer or localization producer. They're often the ones trying to handle all the localization, translations, and stuff like that. Although a lot of times loc producers are more at a publisher, and they're not necessarily at a developer. So it's hard to say whether the loc producers are there or not. So, again, there's a lot of different variants. There's some various job title differences. And also, while we're talking about this as far as job titles, so you'll also see a second set of job titles that are confusing and interrelated, and also can mean the same things or different things. And so you'll hear two terms. One is called project manager, and there's another one called product manager. Now, the PMs, so to speak, are a person who can be exactly the same. So the PM job title, especially project manager, a project manager is usually just a producer. So if you ever see the title project manager, you can assume that they're probably a producer or maybe a senior producer, but there's somebody who's kind of in that role, and they're probably doing 100% or 95% of the same work. It's just some companies use product manager because the product managers are the people that or the PMs, I guess we should say, are that term and that name came from the traditional software world. So if you go to a Google or you go to a Microsoft or whatever, they often were using different names for a producer. And so in the game industry, producer is the most common name, but you will see that the PM titles, both project and program managers, are loosely interrelated. Now, the one that's the most confusing is the product manager role. So again, project manager is the person who's managing the project, and that's really a producer. Now, the program manager, this is a job title that is far more confusing for most people. And the program manager is often a person who is could be doing the same exact thing as a project manager. Like, I've actually seen job descriptions and stuff for program managers that were 100% the same as a project manager. It was just a different name, a different title, and they were 100% a producer. They were managing schedules, they were managing all that kind of stuff in that. And so that is some people's definition of a program manager. However, when you get into mobile games specifically, and other types of games, and especially free-to-play games, that job title has gotten really blurry. And so you have to be really careful there. And if you're going out and you want to find a job as a producer and you're thinking about that, or if you have somebody on your team that you're having to work with who is a program manager, it might be good to kind of try to figure out what their actual role is on the project, or what they're really wanting from that role. Because again, it can be a little bit deceiving. And so in a mobile game studio, especially, the program managers have absolutely nothing to do with the producer. It's a completely, totally, utterly different job and in totality. And so you do need to be careful about that and be aware of that. And so the program managers, especially for mobile companies, are somebody who handles the game data. And this means that once your game kind of starts to go live, once you start getting feedback from a game, that game is going to generate a bunch of live data. And that could be like how many users you're getting, what the retention rates are, what user acquisitions are happening, and they're tracking monetizations and all these kinds of things. And so those guys are working in like an SQL database, and they're tracking by the day, by the hour, whatever it is. They're tracking, how's the game doing, and then they're working with the design team in order to figure out. They're working with the design team in order to figure out how to make the game better. And so, really, the PMs are kind of their own little. The program managers or product managers are really the guys who are working with a lot of the data, and they're really kind of, in my mind, more of somebody who's in part of the design team versus somebody who's part of the production team. And so be aware of that those job titles can definitely get a little blurry. And so, and again, just with producers in general, it can get, pretty scary sometimes about who's doing what and trying to figure out who does what. And that can lead to problems on teams because things can sometimes slip between the cracks, as you could have multiple producers and they all assume that somebody else is doing that job. So you do want to be a little bit careful. So let's kind of jump in and talk about some of the different roles and some of the different things that producers do. And I'm going to try and show you some documents here. Hopefully you guys can see them okay. We're going to take a look at a bunch of just example documents and talk about a bunch of different areas that a producer is responsible for at most companies. But again, keep in mind that caveat that the job and the role of a producer can vary a lot. So you do need to be aware of whether you're trying to become one or whether you're working with one, to kind of understand where their roles and responsibilities start and stop, right? And what's needed there, because it definitely can be varied a lot. So let's see here. Let's jump in. And so this is the first time I've streamed using this desktop view here. So hopefully you guys can see it okay. I'll try to make sure and blow things up as much as I can. But one of the first things that quite often a game producer does is they have to pitch the game. They are the liaison between the team and the outside world. So the job of a producer quite often is to be that guy who's that intermediary between good. Thank you, Kitty. To be that intermediary between the game team and whoever else that is. So that could be the executive management team, that could be the publisher, that could be investors, that could be, just anybody who sits outside of the team quite often needs to know about the project. And so the producer is that person who's doing his job. If he's doing his job right and doing it well, he's shielding the entire team from the rest of the outside world, so that the rest of the world can focus on what it needs to do. Right. And so that's an important part where the team just wants to work. The team just needs to work day in and day out and doesn't need to get all that clutter from the outside world. And so as you become like an executive producer, especially, but this can still be for senior producers and normal producers, a lot of your job is about pitching. So you're, again, going to be that person now that doesn't mean you won't have a project lead or creative director or somebody in the room with you. But quite often when you go in to do a pitch, which is a significant amount of the time, because again, one of your main primary jobs as a producer is managing the outside world. And so by doing that also means you need to be, kind of having these meetings and doing these pitches and doing these presentations that are going to be about what your game is and trying to get the buy off, for that. So right here, I'm going to show you guys just really quickly a pitch that I created for a game based on the movie 300. I don't know if you guys have seen 300 or not, but this character in the front here is his name is Delios. And Delios was the only guy in the movie that lives, and he was the guy that tells the story. It's his VO narration on it. And so we had the rights to 300, and we were doing a kind of a spiritual successor to it. And so the whole game was was about the idea of Delios going in kind of like Rambo, and he was going to go up into Persia, and basically after the Battle of Thermopylae, where all the 300, all of his brothers died, he was going to go up there and basically try to slow down the Persians and kind of go in there and sabotage them and do all sorts of stuff. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole pitch. That's not what today is about. We'll get into pitching and how to pitch in another thing. But as a game producer, again, I just want to show you, like, you would have this document, right? And you would be walking them through and talking to them about your unique selling points, telling them about the game, showing them, who's in it, who's playing in it, and so you're just going to walk them through, what the game is, right? And so you have to have a really good understanding of what the game is. And again, you might have a creative lead who's there too. So maybe the creative lead might take over for this part of the presentation. You might be kind of the guy that opens it. You might be the guy that closes it. But you're also going to be the guy who's talking about, you're going to be the one who talks about like the schedules and the budgets and the production, and all these other things that are there. And so, I'm not going to get into this whole thing. This is a 49 slide, presentation. But the point being is that, all of these things are really, important for you as a producer to understand how to pitch. And then there's things like, I will show this video. Hopefully this will play okay. This was a pitch video for the game that we put together. You can see it's still pretty rough. And that was some actual in-game renderings there. We had some pieces of finished in-game art, but not all of it. But you can kind of see this is also just part for a subject for another day, but how the process of going from really rough to more finished, how, again, you can sell ideas, and just this idea of how you can, build out these whole scenes, and how you can, make them fun and exciting, even without like full color, high resolution, graphics. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this here. So again, just kind of some ideas about, this is, as a game producer, this is a really important part of your job, is being able to pitch these things. Now, the next job that I would say is kind of maybe the biggest, or maybe one of the more important things to understand is scheduling. And I'm not going to get into scheduling again in uber detail here, because we just don't have time, to teach you how to schedule in this short of time. But I wanted to kind of just show you guys some examples of stuff. Let me try to avoid the picture-in-picture here. All right. So in short, when you're putting together these schedules, there's a lot of different ways that a schedule can be put together. In some cases, this was just done in Excel, and you can do kind of an initial design just in Excel. And then there's a million other programs out there from Microsoft Project, on forward that allow you to schedule. And so whatever and however you do it, one of the most important things about scheduling is that you have to organize it, right? And so one of the number one skills as a producer is being organized, not forgetting things, and just being able to be organized in general is something that's absolutely critical as a game producer. And so, because if you let anything slip through the cracks, it literally can kill your project. And if there's things that you forget about, that can really, hamper you a lot. And so I'm going to shrink this down just a little bit more. And then let me put this header at top was a little bit hard to, a little bit too big. Okay. So being able to organize your stuff and be able to think logically and think in systems, is a really good trait, because not everybody on the team thinks that way. And so the problem is that a lot of features in games especially are very multidisciplinary. And so there could be a single thing, we'll call it, let's take a character, for example, that you want to put into the game. That one character, to go from initial concept all the way to completed, might touch 5, 10, even 20 different people's hands. It's not like, you sit down and say, and assign a schedule, assign something to somebody and just says, okay, you're going to do all this yourself, right? No, there's lots of stuff where, as an example, as a concept artist, or even for that initial idea, maybe a game designer starts with it. And a game designer might write up a paragraph or a page or whatever it is in text. And he might say, here's the different attributes of what I'm kind of looking for. I want a big character. I want him heavy duty. He's got to be really strong. He carries a sword. He's got a helmet on. And the game designer is like putting some stuff in there that kind of relate to what the character should look like, or what the character should be. And then that often is passed to a concept artist. And then a concept artist is giving just kind of a rough framework of like, okay, here's what we want, and so now the concept artist may work on it, and he initially does the concepts. And then maybe that same concept artist or somebody might do the perspective drawings that needed to be modeled, and so now somebody has to create some like, left, right, top, perspective drawings, so that a 3D modeler can then go and model it. And so now a 3D modeler might do all the modeling, texturing. Maybe somebody helps. Some teams have specialists in texturing that even come in and help, or setting up the textures in the game engine. And so there's several steps there in that modeling process for creating a character. And then you have to think about, like, now it has to be animated. So somebody has to rig it. Somebody has to put the skeletal system inside of it. And then somebody else has to animate it, whether it's through motion capture or hand animation. And then, you get kind of the raw asset done, but it's still not done, right? It's still not in the game engine. And so now, now it needs to go potentially to a tech artist or somebody who like exports it out into the game engine and gets it, in the game engine and sets it up in the game engine. And there may be some back and forth because maybe the textures don't work, or maybe they need to have, more specialized textures, done in the game engine. Especially if you're working just in, say, 3D Studio or Maya or another package, there's definitely got to be work on the shader side, within the game engine itself. And so that's where it gets, really tricky. And, so on and so forth. Now, engineering might get involved, right? Engineering might have to set up that character, might have to put AI on it, might have to put, player controls on it, might have to set it up for a create player customization system. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And so, so at some point that character will get in the game, but it's really easy for things to fall through the cracks when you don't, when you don't have, a producer who's tracking kind of all those things and understanding that everything goes through a lot of different, people's hands. And then there can be problems where, for example, let's say the guy who's modeling it gets behind, right? And so he's like, oh, well, I'm going to take 3 more weeks and I'm going to go work on another character. And then I'm going to come back and try to finish this one. Well, on his schedule, that might be okay. But I mean, maybe the poor animator is waiting for that model and that animator can't work until the model's finished. And so now there could be an animator who's just literally sitting around picking his nose all day because he's waiting for this 3D model to be finished from a modeler. So it's not acceptable for that modeler to go in and take those extra couple weeks off if there's a codependency where somebody's waiting for you, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that the producers or development director type people who are working on the schedule, that's their job, right? That's their responsibility, is to really make sure that any of these codependencies are not happening. And so you'll see even things like characters, like I didn't mention, like special effects, and setting up, like this was a game called Teenage Wrestling that I worked on. And so you can see these are real production documents. These are things that we actually used. And setting up, collision systems, setting up, all of the special effects, setting up the sound, there was a bunch of stuff I didn't even talk about. And so, somebody has to go in and like set up every move. So like, you can't just do the animation, for example, in this kind of a fighting game, I have a punch and I do the punch. animation, and the animation's there, but there's a designer that now needs to go hook up that animation and needs to be like, okay, when I press the A button, it then triggers something, which then triggers the punch animation, right? And that's now working or in game. But, and then what happens when my punch lands on another character and hits him, and how does that work? And so there's all these levels that, again, that character is being, worked on so many different levels. And so you have to be, really diligent as a producer to really understand, exactly, what are all these things are, what are all these different moves, understanding the differences of like cameras and controls, and, here's creative players and weapons, the career mode, which is the story mode for the games, and so this is just, this is a really, really, really high level, thing. But again, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but this schedule never got finished, but the idea here was this was going to be kind of a Gantt chart where you would see, now week to week, what things were being done and what they were worked on and when. And so if this had been finished, these bars would have pushed out here. This was actually a test that I was trying to do to kind of see if we could do all of our scheduling within Excel, because we were having trouble at that time period. There was not a good scheduling tool that we really liked. And then you also see just things here. What's important to understand, like there's the status, there's a phase, there's priority, departments, the owners, features, tasks. So there's all these things that we're trying to get across here. Not to mention tracking the status of things, like how long, it's start and end dates, its durations, how done it is, how long is it going to take me, i.e. the resources and things like that. So this is just kind of a start at what, a game team might go through. See if there was anything else here. And then this was all just data, that we were using. So that's that. Let me show you guys a few more of these here. One second, here it's going slow. So this was a simple schedule I created for a team of mine in China. This was a game called Infinite Worlds, which was an MMORPG. One second, let me move this over for you. Remember to stay to the right. Whoops. Okay. So, so something else to kind of be aware of, and we'll talk about this next week when we talk about game production, but you'll also see that we divide these things into milestones. And so there's milestones 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are really important for you to kind of understand. It's quite often when you're delivering things as a producer or as a team, you're putting them out kind of on these milestones. They could be 2 week, 4 week, 6 week, 8 week type milestones. It's really up to you. I like a 1 month deliverable. And basically it kind of helps to understand what the high level goals are. So think of this as like the 10,000 foot goal of where you're going to be each month. This is definitely not, detailed at all, right? But this is, again, this would be something that as like an executive producer, this is what I would typically create as an executive producer. So as an executive producer, I might say like, okay, here's all these different milestones, right? And so here's, 12 milestones. So that's 1 year of work, right? And then I've detailed out by department, design, tech, art, right? So here's the high level for what each of these, things are going to do, and just kind of it's a way to start ballparking again who's doing what, design's going to work on these months, and then the next month there's even more design work, and it gets less and changes, kind of over time. So again, this was something that in the game that helped us kind of figure out what is everybody going to be working on and when. So again, this would be where I would typically start with a schedule. I'd start with something very high level, week to week, month to month, but not get into the minutia tasks of things. And so as a schedule monkey, when you're producing work, you really have to understand like how to schedule is really important. We got a couple more here. Wait, let's not jump into that yet. All right, well, let's move on from scheduling. I think that was the main schedules. So now the next thing I want to talk about is budget. So as a game producer, this is where it gets a little different. Now, quite often the executive producer or senior producers are in charge of the budgets. And so it's up to you to kind of figure out, who's working on what and when and how and why. But all of that relates to number of man hours that are sort of being worked and, and how many people, are working on these things. And so ultimately you have to kind of figure out, what are my resource plans? So there's two things kind of going on here simultaneously. And so this first one here that we're looking at is actually what I would call a resource plan. So what this is by looking at this column here, this is identifying who is needed on the project. So this is a team list here. Now, in this particular case, this studio, this was a company I owned called Globex. We had offices in multiple countries. And so we had a certain number of staff that were going to be in our Los Angeles office, which was these people here. And then we had an office in China. And so we can see that, that there was, a whole lot of people here in our China team. And so you can see that, this is a very, very long list of just how many people were there. And then I had some additional live ops and live services teams as well that would come on, after the fact. And so what this is then showing is, we just a minute ago talked about milestones and what a milestone was. And so here, milestone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is a month-to-month breakdown of who is needed on the projects. And so you can see here that in some cases there's 0, meaning, this person is not needed until milestone 4. And so that would be when we'd hire them or transfer them from another project or whatever, but that's when they would officially kind of start. And so some of these people are starting right away, but then you can see other people don't ramp in, for like 8 months. And so this is kind of showing, you can see here, a lot of people don't ramp in until really late, right? And so that's what this is kind of showing, is this is a resource plan, or a staffing plan. You can also see a high level schedule here. You can kind of see, when is the prototype going to be there, alpha, beta and up to launch. So this was a 26-month project. So a little over 2 years, long of a project. And, in this particular case, you can see that, we had, because we had multiple projects, some were working on the global, meaning company wide. Some people were working on a specific project. And so in this particular one, we weren't showing. Later on, we did some scenarios that actually had project X and project Y and how people would kind of go back and forth between them. But again, so high level milestones, high level deliverables, month by month, who's doing what. This is just a summary to show like how many total months are they working. And so when it's all said and done, then I can see these totals and can be, understanding, again, what's my total amount of resources that are being applied to that, there. And then through that, I can also figure out my budgets and start to figure out, how much money is everything going to cost, and how much total are we going to spend? Like we had a $10 million budget, where is that all going to, right? So, now another variation of this. So in this particular case, I just have kind of showing that they're working on that particular project. But you can have other variations. Let's see here. Okay. So we'll show you this one. So this is very similar. You'll see that the milestones are up here at the top. You'll see that the rough schedule from kickoff to alpha, and everything is over there. So all the way down to, this is a 34-month, at least total thing with 24 months, 24, 26 months was kind of the core development cycle. And so, we had divided in this particular company, we had an engine team, we had a core game team, we had a corporate team. And then we had a casual game team as well. And then we also were budgeting in a second game team. So as a company, we were working on 2 large games, 1 small game, along with some corporate breakdowns, corporate stuff. And then I was able to break down by cost exactly to know exactly where and how much everything was going to go, how much were these games going to cost. And so by this, this is a big chunk of what the game costs, are going to be. And so in the same way, you can see that there's zeros here or nothing there, meaning these guys don't come in. These guys are not even going to be hired until a year into the project here. And then I'm seeing what their costs are per month. And so again, it's just it kind of varies, but again, this is just a way as a producer for you to kind of understand and build out some rough models to say, here's all my staff, here's my staffing plan, here's my hiring plans, and stuff. And because a big part of the job of a producer also is hiring. And so, you're also going to be working with your department heads and stuff, but you may come down here and say like, okay, well, I need some programmers, and these programmers all need to be like in-house, let's say started and working by this time, which is 13 months into the project. So knowing how slow or fast your corporate hiring processes are and knowing, all these things, you might need to actually start hiring here and knowing that it might take you 3 months to actually like go out, get a job description, write it all out and then, interview people and then like get them maybe in the house, by the first of this month at the latest. But you gotta start putting in some buffers. You gotta kind of understand again, how do you account for, stuff that's not always obvious here, right? And so again, this is the job of a producer, is really like thinking 10 steps ahead. This is like an elaborate game of chess, right? And you're really having to think about like, how much money do I have? How long do things really take? How close can I cut it? Because I want to keep my budget under control. So like, if I don't have these guys by this date, what happens? Like, is the project going to like come to a screaming halt? Am I going to be in trouble? So do I want to try to maybe budget these in where, maybe I account for them. All right, that didn't work there, but maybe I account for them months earlier in the budget, so that I might hire them, say, a month early to make sure that they're in-house, they're trained, they're ready, they're established, and then like they can hit the ground running when I actually need them. And so you need to kind of differentiate when you absolutely need a resource versus when a resource should actually be there. And please, guys, as a side note, please ask me questions. And, feel free to chime in, and hopefully this is making sense. And sorry, I'm covering a lot of stuff today, very quickly. And so, but I'm trying to give you guys kind of a really high level overview of what a producer does. And that's really hard because producers do a lot. Another real quick thing, we're talking about budgets, but, again, like producers quite often are responsible for the budgets, at least at some level. And you need to be thinking about not just all of the people and how much do they cost, but you're also thinking about, well, what are all these other overheads? What's all this other stuff that I'm spending money on? And just all the way down to like food, like how much is our food going to cost the team, and just making sure that all that stuff is accounted for and everything else. Because quite often as a producer, you're the one often like buying things, and then you have to expense it. And so you might have a corporate credit card, or you might have your own money, but you may have to be, say, buying dinners for your team. And then you're the one that's going to then expense that and get that money back. And so that can be a burden on a lot of designers or a lot of producers that you got to kind of work out, because if it takes you a couple months to get, say, a reimbursement, or you're trying to reimburse things that you were never approved for and all that, it gets tricky. And so you might be the one managing the budgets day to day. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're the one who's approving it day to day. And so you do have to make sure you're understanding that. And next, let's talk about outsourcing. So, a lot of you, I think, because of CG Spectrum being this, incredible resource for, artists and, teaching art and stuff like that. So, I think a lot of you are artists. And obviously you've probably all heard about outsourcing, and this, this is a huge trend in our industry, I think both for games and movies, right? And that we may have some or all of our artists in-house, but these days, especially with most game teams, you're typically going to have, all or at least a big chunk of your art your art resources not in the same building. You may have them in another country, in Asia or Western Europe, Eastern Europe, whatever. But it's very, very common these days to have these people out of house and probably not part of your same company. Now, if you're a really big company like Ubisoft or something like that, they might what we call insource. So insourcing would be like, okay, we're going to have one of our studios in Bulgaria like do some part of the art for a game, but that studio, even though it's owned by us, it's still a third party, meaning they're not in-house and you still have to manage them. So as a producer, one of your main jobs is actually making sure that, again, all external relationships get handled. And so the first of those relationships is upper management. The second of those is any external partners. The most important of those being art outsourcing. That typically is the biggest of these. And so quite often, again, you're trying to figure out how many of these things do you have, how long are they going to take, how much man months, and then ultimately this is about budget, right? And so again, this kind of comes back to why it's all interrelated to budget. Is you're managing these things to make sure they're getting done, but you're also making sure they're getting done on time and on budget, and you're managing the codependencies of these things with your external partners to make sure that these things are going to be useful to the team when they need them versus getting done, say 6 months too late, and then they don't make it into the game or something like that, right? And so this is a big part of your job is to now. Again, in some companies, you might actually have an art producer or an outsourced producer. So at bigger companies and bigger teams, this is actually its own separate person. And the difference there quite often is that on one hand, as a producer, you're not an artist, or you're usually not an artist. And this is where you can cross paths. So if you're an artist and you want to become a producer, you can actually become, say, an outsourced producer or an art producer, and your art skills will come in handy. But in this particular case, what a producer is really tracking is how many of these things are being done, how many are being worked on, what's the budget for these things, when are they being delivered, and did somebody deliver them? Did I pay for them? Did I get all the legal contracts in place? And did I verify and validate with the team that those things are the right things and done according to plan? But, if you're not an art producer, you're not going to be able to look at a piece of art generally and say like, ooh, that's good or bad, right? So your job is to take a bunch of art assets, pass them along to, say, the art director or the art team or somebody else who then is going to look at those assets and then check them off a list and say like, okay, yes, this was done, this was done, this was done. Oh, wait, we need a revision of this. Now we need this to be redone. And so then they send it back to you, which you then send it back to the third party outsource company. And you're that in-between person that's making sure that this thing is working smoothly as these things go back and forth, because most art assets generally I find are generally iterated on like 2 to 5 times minimum, from an art outsource company. And so you do have to have a process in place and people in place to understand how to take these things from just being a number here, and this to, is this something you want? And then are they getting the right feedback? So then like an art director, for example, needs to say like, oh no, well, this is wrong here. Like this part of the texture, this needs to be orange. And then, over here needs to be, built up a little bit stronger or whatever. They need to give that feedback as well. And that feedback needs to then also have a process and a pipeline to get back to that outsource company and be done. And then you, again, as a producer, can validate and check that stuff. And so that's still a tricky problem for a lot of teams. There's still not, in my opinion, really great tools for managing creative projects at that level. And so quite often we end up in Excel, or we end up with kind of partial things that just don't work terribly well as solutions. And so these tend to be a lot of manual labor and, manual costs there to do that. Now, the next part of localization that's very common for a producer to manage is audio. Now, I would say that I'm guessing right now, but I would say about 20% of teams and companies have in-house audio. I would guess that a significant amount use a third-party person. Most teams, unless you're a really big company, don't have enough work to keep a audio person busy for 1 to 2 years for a full project. So that being said, whether you're outsourcing this to or insourcing this to somebody who's maybe part of your company, but not necessarily full-time 24/7 on your project, or whether you're outsourcing this to, thousands or one of the thousands of different audio companies out there, this has to be addressed. And so audio can be done in outsourcing both in the sound effects, the music, and the voiceover. Now, your game might not have voiceover, but generally it's going to have, at least some kind of special effects and some kind of music or background audio or just other types of things that make sound in the game, right? So audio is a really, really big part of that. And then if it's voiceover, people speaking, right? Then that voiceover also then falls into what's called localization. And this is the localization is the second part of what you also would manage as an external team there. And we'll talk about both of these just kind of together because they're interrelated. So localization can be localizing just text. And it can be just, putting and literally like somebody translating text from one language to another. And that's one part of localization. And that's what most people think that's all it is. But in reality, localization actually is a lot more complicated than that. And the localization could even be things like a good example was we did a character when I was at Microsoft, a game called Munch's Odyssey. And in that game, the character Abe was his race was called a Mudakan, and they were a four-fingered character. And so we didn't think anything about it. And it was just cool and it was different. And he had his four fingers. Well, then Microsoft wanted us to take the game over to Japan. And this was something that, I didn't even know at the time and that we didn't know was that in Japan, you're not allowed to have a four-fingered character. And there's a whole thing about the Yakuza, and the Yakuza basically like they chop off their little finger, right, when they screw up. And so this is kind of an insult, and this is like a bad thing, in Japan. But we had no idea that was wrong and that was not allowed in Japan. And so we had to, at the last minute, like completely remodel the character. Actually, I think we took him to three fingers, not four, but that required like, not a massive amount of work, but it definitely like we had to rework his whole skeleton. We had to put new animations together. We had to do a whole bunch of stuff to make him three-fingered instead of four. So that's just one example. And there's thousands of examples of cultural problems or things like for a long time, for example, in Germany, you're not allowed to show blood. Germany has always been squeamish about blood in games for some reason. And so in games like Command and Conquer, we actually, whenever you run over a character and they leave a blood splat on the ground, in US, it would be red and we called it out as blood. But in Germany, we actually reworked it. And so the blood came out as black and we called it oil. And we said that you weren't killing humans, that you were killing robots. And so the robot left an oil stain, on the ground. And that was a change that we had to make because of localization and because of cultural sensitivities. And so again, that was something as a producer, you have to sort of be aware of that, or you have to know how to work with people that understand these problems. So just to be aware of localization can be changing text. It can be changing audio, so voiceovers and stuff. If I speak in English, I might have to hire a voiceover actor that's going to, do that. It might also be, again, all these other hundreds of things that could go wrong in your game that you have to be aware of. And so that's part of it. And then we'll dig in just a minute, a little bit more on localization, but to go back kind of to audio. So in audio, there's, again, let's assume it's a third-party company you're hiring. You got to go find the people to do the work. You got to make sure that the team is speccing out the work, and build that whole relationship. And again, because it's an outside company or whether it's, whatever, they're not part of your core team. And so you're going back and forth in making sure and managing that relationship, right? And you're making sure that that's going to work, on a day-to-day level. And you're making sure that, everything is going to be appropriate, right? And making sure that it's, done to the right specifications and everything else. So audio has a lot of stuff there where you're going to find the company and manage them. Now with voiceover, this is actually where it gets tricky and where a producer can spend a lot of time here depending on the game. So especially in a big AAA game, a producer is going to have to work with a voiceover. And so if you're working on a game that has a lot of VO, and I've had games, a couple RPGs I've worked on, I've had over 10,000 lines of dialogue. So if you think about that, there's 10,000 lines of somebody has to sit in a room, and say 10,000 lines of dialogue just in English, right? And now I got to go do that in German, French, Spanish, and everything else. And so you got to really make sure you nail that dialogue, right. And then make sure it's locked down, and then make sure it can get translated there. But let's just say you have 10 characters in the game, you have to work as a producer or often working with the creative lead to go find that talent, find the right people. You might have to audition 100 people just to find 10 that you like, to find the right type of voice you like, all that kind of stuff. And then you're also working with the design team and the writers to make sure that dialogue isn't going to change, because quite often you're going to get in the booth and you're going to record all this VO, which is very expensive. And then you're going to, record it all. And then if the designers come back and are like, oh, I need to change a line, that can be really hard and potentially impossible. In fact, in some cases, this is more detail of like how you and what you have to know as a producer. So for instance, from a legal standpoint, which we'll talk about legal stuff in a minute, you have to make sure that that you can even go back in and re-record. So there's a group called the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, which is in Hollywood, who controls a lot of the voiceover, voice acting, writers, things like that. And so you don't have to use SAG, but quite often it's a long story of why you do or don't. But if you're using like a SAG group, they have a minimum often of either 1 day or half a day of time. And so if you wanted to say just do one line of VO that was going to take 5 minutes to do, you might have to pay them for a full day of work. And so you're talking like $100 an hour, and it's probably a lot more than that actually, but let's just say it's $100 an hour. That's going to cost you $800 just to do that one line of dialogue, right? So that's the kind of stuff as a producer you have to be really managing tightly, because you just can't keep going back in the office and going back in there. Now, occasionally, once in a while, we mentioned Munch's Odyssey a minute ago. We actually were very lucky in that Lauren Lanning, the CEO of the company, has an absolute amazing voice. The guy is beyond talented. And Lauren was doing all the voices for the Munch's Odyssey game himself. And so there was 10 different characters, all with totally different voices. And Lauren actually did all of it himself. And so it was great. And it actually saved us, because if we hadn't had him doing that, we would never have shipped the game, not in the time frame and stuff that we wanted. Because we literally, I think, were in the voiceover booth recording new dialogue a day or two before we shipped. I mean, it was that close. But if that had been a traditional voiceover actor, we could have never done that. We would have had to lock our script and just had problems with it. And that was a problem. So audio and managing audio, voiceover, sound effects, all these kinds of things are really tricky. And so we won't go into this in detail, but this is about, your casting character list. Which characters do you want? You need to have your scripts, and we're talking about legal here. So one part of this is that, you need to, as a producer, be very aware of legal. And I actually wanted to show really quick a book here. There's a game called Video Game Law in a Nutshell, by Dan Nabel. And I'll pull it up here to kind of show you guys. Hopefully you can see that in the light. So anyways, if you're looking to become a producer or anything like that, I highly recommend this book. This came out a couple years ago, I believe. It's the Nutshell series. But as a producer, again, this is something you need to understand. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer, but as a game producer, you are going to be looking at a ton of contracts, and you need to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed and everything is done, because one of those external departments that you're going to be working with is the legal team. And that's going to be another big stressful part of your job, because they're not usually very fun to work with. There's a few lawyers out there that I've enjoyed, Patrick Sweeney and a few others who have just been absolutely amazing. And there's been a lot of lawyers I've worked with that are a little challenging. And so this is definitely a hard part of the job, and that you have to make sure that you're getting out the right types of contracts. You may not necessarily be reviewing the contracts, but for example, this is why I bring it up now with audio, is that you need to make sure that there's that everybody has all the right, documents in place. So like every person who does any speaking or anything like that, they need to have a contract. They need to have a liability thing where they're, basically giving you permission to use their voice and that kind of stuff. And then, you might have to make sure that, if you're filming them on camera too, like that takes another, set of legal documents. And, the company that's like doing the recording and things, they need a set of legal documents and contracts and, and so on and so forth. And so every single external person you work with, almost always, and especially every single company you work with, is going to need some sort of a legal contract. In fact, well, let me pull up one right now to show you. One of the most common contracts that you'll be using a lot of and sending out a lot of are what's called an NDA. So a non-disclosure agreement. Now, so that's what this non-disclosure agreement here is about. And we won't go through all this. If you've never looked at an NDA and you're looking to become a producer, you definitely want to look at these things. But these are what you send out to everybody. Basically, it protects both sides. They're called a mutual NDA. And that mutual NDA basically is trying to protect both sides. So basically, if either of us are having a conversation, we start talking, and and we're talking about, whatever, whether it's ideas or whatnot, then that this document protects us mostly. It is. I do know lawyers and do know people in the industry that believe that NDAs don't really protect us that much. If you're a really good lawyer or a slimy person, there's lots of ways to get around these things, the NDAs and stuff. But from a legal perspective, this is something, again, that you have to just make sure that every little thing is being done for legal reasons. And in fact, you have to keep on top of this. I joined a company some years ago, and I won't name who messed up so badly, but the team thought that everything was ready to go. They were literally, when I joined the company, they were about 1 month, maybe 2 months at most, but I think about 6 weeks from actually launching the game. So they thought they were all ready to launch the game, and they were preparing kind of for launch. I came on board and looked at the game and was like, oh my God, this thing's a mess. And it needed so much work. There was no way it was going to get finished in 6 weeks. It needed like 3 or 4 months minimum of work, in my opinion. And so upper management was like, well, we don't care. We want you just to ship it, and you just got to get it out anyways. And, quality doesn't really matter, but just, get this thing out there, and ship it. And so, I pulled my hair out and was like, great, what are we going to do? So, I got everybody kind of involved and was just trying to go through the checklist to see, who was doing what. And the producers that were on the project, I was a vice president, not the producer. So I was kind of running the whole studio. But long story short, as we went in and actually started looking through what they were doing, it turned out that the legal team, the producer, had never talked to our legal team. And so they had not done any of the legal paperwork. And this was a licensed franchise product that required a ton of paperwork to get done before we could legally launch the game. And it needed all these approvals and it needed all kinds of stuff. And nobody had ever thought about doing any of that. Not a single piece of legal paperwork was actually filed for the project. And so in the end, that legal process actually took us about 4 months. And so for me, I was able to point the finger at legal, point the finger at the producers, not going to legal, and basically blamed it all there, and kind of quietly inside, had a sigh of relief going, all right, now we have more time to work on the game and make it better, and we can point the finger at them, and it's not our fault. And so that was a win-win for me that I kept quiet, but it was an important win-win. But the point is if we had been ready and if we had wanted to ship this thing on time, the fact that the producer dropped the ball and hadn't talked to legal and hadn't done any of the legal stuff, and not realizing that the legal process can sometimes be 2 to 6 months on some stuff. A lot of legal stuff takes a long time, whether it's for a new project or even just all the stuff that goes into when you're working on a project to make sure that it's all authorized and everything. And so point being is if you're a producer, you really have to be paying attention to legal. So, that's one of the tricky parts, right? Now, I think we already went through this one here. Now I'll talk about another thing, kind of moving on. Actually, let's make sure let me finish with localization. Sorry. Get distracted here. So we talked about all the voiceover. Again, you can set a process together. So again, like here, schedule a meeting with your operation, your team about 12 months before your submission date. So a lot of these things take a really long time. And so if you don't, as a producer, understand or know like how long things take, it's very easy to misunderstand, how long something's going to take. So in this particular case, you're looking for, if you guys can see this, okay, these are the names of the characters in the game, what the character's kind of purpose is, how many lines of dialogue they are. And this actor film category was really who we kind of envisioned them to be, so on and so forth. And so again, this is just a quick list. That's kind of that initial thing that you can talk to people about, and kind of who all is going through it. So that's there. Let's see the script, locking again down the script and figuring that out. We'll look at this in a minute. This is one of the scripts I wrote for Tales of Despero, but again, just, a sample example of, that these scripts again can be really, really, really long. And again, but what you're really covering is, where are they in the game, i.e. the level, what their file names are, because you also want to make sure that whoever is going to do the work is also naming them appropriately, so you can figure out kind of what's what, which character is going to be in the game, which character is saying this, what the dialogue is, any context, audio direction as well, so on and so forth, right? So just there's a lot of things in here that you have to get right, before you go to record your script. And so as a producer, you may not necessarily be doing the work. Sorry, that one's impossible to read, but you're managing this whole process, right? And then we're talking about localization. And so this is about, translating the game into lots of different languages and trying to understand that this does take a long time. But the biggest problem with localization that you have is the fact that the design team is quite often changing things to the very last minute. I mean, and this is going to be a conflict, in why you as game designers. So let me pause for a minute and kind of talk about that. So as a game designer, if you don't understand what a producer does, if you don't understand, why this job is hard and why they're asking for certain things, it can really be easy sometimes just to be like, well, leave me alone. I'm working. I'm in a creative process. I'm doing whatever I have to do or what I want to do, or, any of that kind of stuff. Right. And you don't want to be bothered because you just want to be able to keep making changes like whenever you want. However, the reality is that if you understand that even like localization can take about 2 months. And so if you might be sort of approaching, let's call it open beta, where the game is basically going to be done and live. If you want to go at that point and go in multiple languages, it's a little easier if you're English only or one language only. But if you want to like do this across multiple, and if you want to, localized to multiple languages and have that game live in, day one in multiple languages, you need to lock like the scripts maybe 2 months ahead of time, because it takes a long time to go there and localize, get it all changed, especially if there's voiceover work, and validate it all. And then, the engineers have to write a program or something, a way to bring all that data back in and to know that, like, when I select the game, if I'm in Germany or whatever, it's going to play the stuff in German, or I can switch the languages or whatever. So there's coding involved. There's the localization team that's involved. There's the producer. There's all this stuff involved. And so as you as a game designer, if you don't realize that I have to lock my script 2 months before, I even go beta, that's like around the time of alpha. As a level designer, especially, this is incredibly hard. And so it might be faster and easier and possible if it's text only, but especially if it's voiceover, it requires a lot more, practice, and so my point is as a game designer, you need to be very aware of these things. And the same thing could be as an artist or whatever, right? If you know something's going to take a really long time, you need to be able to know that your actual schedules reflect that. And so that you're trying to lock certain things down ahead of time, without, getting too crazy. Because otherwise, you're going to keep writing stuff and redoing it and writing it, redoing it, writing it, redoing it. And that's going to cost you money and too much time and stuff like that. So just be aware that this is a huge problem for most game teams, and trying to lock, especially your text down for your missions and stuff like 2 months ahead of time is a nightmare for some teams. And so that's something you need to be very aware of. So Kitty is asking, as a producer, do you prefer to record voice actors and then animate characters talking, or try and have voice actors match the animation? In all honesty, Kitty, I've seen both done. I know that animated movies quite often are doing the I guess the first one, and that you record the voices and then you animate to those voices. And so I know that that's how Pixar does it. In a lot of your big movie productions, or especially your animated shows, would always record the VO first, and then go and work on all the animation and kind of make the stuff match the voices. I think in games, because one, we rarely use even facial animation except for in cutscenes. And two, I think for a long time, all we did was what we call flapping. So like our voice, what we do is usually there's software that kind of just detects if there's voice that's being spoken, and there's a modulation of your audio, right? And quite often we just wrote a tool that just basically said, the higher the peak, like the bigger the opening, and you just kind of, your mouth would just, in the same way that this is peaking, your mouth is just kind of opening and closing with, so if the peak goes to 0, then my mouth goes to 0, right? So it's that kind of thing that it's there. And so because it's not very precise, it's easier for us just to have a simple animation system and then do the VO later. And that way the VO can change and all that kind of stuff. But again, there's not a right or wrong answer here. But I think it's just a matter of as games get more realistic, as games have bigger budgets and things like that, then going the Pixar route of like doing a voiceover and then animating to that voice, or using facial motion capture or some other technique is definitely the better way to go. I mean, you're going to get more accuracy. You're going to get more life in it. Your animation's going to look better, all that kind of stuff. So that is the more ideal route. But as a producer or just as a game developer in general, it's always about time and budget, right? And that's the hard compromise that producers are struggling with on a daily basis to say, what can we do in the time we have, with the budget we have, with the technology that we have, and everything else, and everything's kind of a compromise. And that's what's hard here. And so it's always about just figuring out what you can do with what you got. And that's the bane of our existence. And lastly, kind of on the process stuff for audio, again, establish this process. Yep. You're welcome, Kitty. The process that you're having, for this stuff should all be established. And if this has not been established, if you're a producer, there's going to be a lot of work you're going to need to do to talk about process and pipelines. And next week, we're going to be talking about the game development process. And so I'm not going to get too deep into these things today. It's a related topic to being a game producer, but really I want to talk about the different processes for all the different teams and all the different things, and basically how is a game made from start to finish, and then all the pipelines and processes that go into that. But if you don't have a process established on these things, then your job as a producer is to help establish that process, because ultimately, that process can kill you if it's done wrong, right? So you got to be a little careful there. And again, this just kind of shows that like this is just for localization here, but there's so many things, and you can see here, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, lots of stuff where, these things can take a long time. Like for instance, finalizing US audio. Well, this is even after you've recorded the audio. So if I've gone in the sound studio and I've recorded the audio, and all those audio files exist, it still takes the audio guy, that company that you hired, 2 weeks to like clean everything up, to cut it into the right pieces so that each piece is its own little file that's they go in and balance it, they go in and name it the correct names and do all that kind of stuff. And like that could take 2 to 4 weeks just that one step alone. And so, so as you start to get into approvals, you start to get into locking the scripts, you start to get into all these things, and then integrating it and, testing it and everything else, you can see that, these timeframes can really get super crazy. This is 391 days just in, this is just related to audio and localization, right? And so, this again is where, as a producer, you need to be aware of these things, but also as a team member, you need to be working with your producers. The more that you can understand what a producer goes through, the more you can understand the overall process, that helps you as an artist, or helps you as a designer, it helps you as an engineer, if you really understand, what these things are. And I'll show kind of a quick example of a script. I was trying to find a better one, but this was just kind of showing that you'd have kind of, oops, sorry, let me scooch that back. So trying to kind of, again, show that there's a script, and there's a bunch of stuff here that's going to be done. And then where this gets complicated is you then might end up with like US dialogue, but then you might have German, English, French, Spanish, you have this huge, massive database that's somewhere there. And then there's even just the process, if you're an engineer or a designer, of like, how does this stuff get put in the game? If this is like an Excel file, how does that Excel file get edited and then imported into the game and made to work? And it's not always very simple. Like when I was at Insomniac, and Insomniac is, an incredible company with, track record of hit after hit after hit. I don't know they've ever put out a bad game, right? But when I worked on Ratchet Deadlock, especially, the system for how we actually did all of our scripts like this for every language in an Excel file. And that Excel file was a nightmare. And because it was really hard to group things together, you just basically had to go to the very end and add stuff on as you kept thinking about stuff. And so it was really hard when you suddenly you got 5,000 lines of dialogue and you're trying to figure out like, oh wait, does that dialogue already exist or not? And you're trying to find it. And it was just such a pain. And then you go in and add one change. Like even if you saw something was misspelled, right? You have to go in and change it and fix it. And then you had to re-import that thing into the game. And it could take sometimes like 30 to 45 minutes or more just to import that Excel file into the game. And if you did it wrong, it completely broke all text in the entire game, from the UI menus to everything. And it went bad, really bad, when that got messed up. And so again, the process of these things can be really critical. And if you don't understand, and especially as a producer, how to organize your stuff, if you don't understand how to do that, it's going to be, really tricky. So just be aware of that. And then lastly, we're talking about legal as far as voice. So here's like a voiceover service agreement. I won't have you read the whole thing, but again, even just, this is a 9-page legal document here that ultimately, also has like their costs and things like that in here. But this is, the full contract needed for us to do voiceover with a client to make sure that it was legally cleared, make sure that their work agreements were all done and everything else. So again, this is just another example of, if you're a producer, you're managing a lot of the legal side of things and making sure that they're not, falling through, but you're also managing the budgets and things like that. And you have to make sure that these guys all get paid. And so you're usually the front man. Like these guys are now going to submit an invoice to you, and you're going to have to submit that invoice to accounting, making sure that, again, all the forms are filled out right. You might have to fill out a form, for your own company just to say, hey, here's a expense reimbursement form or a pay this vendor form or whatever. And you just would submit that form with this form, and then submit that to accounting. And then you want to make sure and follow up, 30 days later or whatever it is, so that to make sure that this vendor got paid, and things like that. So as a producer, there's a lot of stuff where it's just, you got to be super, super, super highly organized, and then also follow up on things and make sure that they got done. Right. And that's the hard part. Next, let's talk about another role of a game producer. So as you get closer to shipping a game, there is a number of different organizations throughout the world that basically validate that you can ship your game. And so if you've never heard of like the ESRB, That's the one that's in America that controls this. And there's a similar related group in Europe called PEGI. And then other countries and other groups all have their own versions of this. And so part of what you're doing is understanding this is what your game rating is going to be. You're trying to figure out, okay, is this game for everybody? Teens, matures, whatever, who's doing what. And you guys as a team and executive management have to decide at what level do you want your games to come in at. And now part of this is that, I'm going to try to come down here just to show one thing here. So whenever they're doing a rating, so these guys are going to give you, you're just like a movie, right? They're going to give you a rating when it's all said and done. That's going to allow you to have that, on your marketing campaigns and when you're on these things to know what the rating for that game is. And I don't know if this shows, sorry, it's long and I wanted to kind of show you a list of it, but those are more for other reasons. Anyways, there's another document basically that basically shows that for every one of these ratings, whether you're M, to R, G, whatever that rating is, whether it's a game or a movie, there's all these different ratings, right? And let's just say I think there's approximately 5 main ratings. So you as a producer have to submit a early version of your game because you need to have this ESRB or PEGI ratings. You need to have this done before the game launches. You can't legally even launch the game without these things being rated. So that's something that's really, really, really critical for you to get right. And you have to make sure that your game is going to get to the rating that you want it to. And so that's really important, especially if it gets from like the equivalent of like a G to PG to like R. There can be, as you saw in the very beginnings, here there's a huge drop down in how many people and how many things get into like mature age ratings. And so basically the higher your rating, the less people that are going to play it or watch it. And so within each one of these categories, they have a huge list. So you can go to ESRB, you can go to PEGI, but they're different and not necessarily radically different, but they are different. And so you need to know that like, if you're going to go to say PEGI and ESRB, you have to like put the list kind of side by side and you have to sort of know like, okay, here's all these different check boxes I have to check off. I can't have blood. I can't have, sex. I can't have, bad language. I can't have all these things. Right. And then your job as a producer is to make sure that your team doesn't do any of that. So you have to like work with your game teams. You got to work with your interface teams. You got to work with your cinematics teams, your creative direction people. Those people might be aware of what this is, but it's ultimately your job to make sure that the game is conforming to whatever ratings you want it to have. And then your job as a producer is to take that early version of the game and submit it, for a pre-approval. And then you'll have to do a final approval later on. And so the ratings for these things, when you're getting into the launch era, again, are really important. And so that's one part of your job. And I won't go much deeper into that. Now, the next part we'll talk about, since we're talking about release, right? So part of that release cycle, the producer's job gets really complicated when it comes into the release cycle. Now, this is especially true and exponentially more true for a retail product. So if you're going to be a producer on a game that is going to be for an Xbox or PlayStation or something that's going to have an actual physical disc manufactured, one, you have to realize that to have a physical disc manufactured, as well as a manual, a box, and everything else that goes with a retail release, that there is months and months of time, like about 2 months worth of lead time that is needed for manufacturing for most companies. And so when you start to think about that, we talked a minute ago about voiceover, right? And voiceover needs a couple months to get done and to get localized into all the different languages. So that could take 2 months. So if that's the case, if I'm doing a retail game, let's just say that's going to ship in Europe as well as America. So it's going to ship in, French, English, German, Spanish. And so that full process there alone could be 4 months, right? And stuff. And so you're having to then lock down like your level designs and stuff like 4 to 6 months before you even like launch. But that's really hard when you've got maybe an 18-month development cycle, and you got to launch, you got to be like locking things down 4 to 6 months ahead of time. So one of the reasons why digital products have become so popular is that it cuts out a significant amount of this problem. We don't have to worry about manufacturing and all these other things that go along with it, the costs associated with that, but also just the timeframes associated with it. And so that's why this is a big deal. And then, the next part of this to kind of understand is just the whole, kind of release cycle. So you as a games producer are somebody who's working on the game's release cycle. And next week, we'll talk more about that process or what that is. But basically, how do I get a game from kind of roughly finished, out into the wild, right? How is that game going to get released? And so as a producer, a big part of your job is making sure that game gets out there again. And whether that's dealing with legal issues, sales, marketing, manufacturing, dealing with, say, Steam, or dealing with, whoever that is. You might also be dealing with Apple. If it's a mobile game, you're going to deal with Apple and Google. If it's a console game, you're dealing with Sony and Microsoft. It can be with Nintendo. So every platform has its own needs, its own problems. And so as you start to get into this release cycle where you're dealing with like, you can have 5 different platforms, and each of those has different needs, both from a technology standpoint as well as a release process standpoint. And so that becomes a huge headache for a producer. And so the end game at the end for a producer can be really hard. And then there's other things that you're also having to understand as far as like, again, the costs and stuff. So quite often there's also things where not only are you having to figure out like if we're going to go into a release cycle, who's paying for what, and who's if it's sales and marketing or user acquisition, it's over here. Is it game development budget? Is it live operations? Is it customer service? Is it manufacturing of the discs? Like who are you writing checks to, right? And there could literally be dozens, if not hundreds, of different companies that you're paying, like the ESRB for the ratings. You have to pay them, and so again, like the producer is managing kind of all that stuff. But on the reverse side, you're also setting up deals or working with the potentially. Now, again, some bigger companies will the budget stuff and all that could either be relegated only to an executive producer or could be relegated outside of your department into like an accounting or finance or somebody like that could be potentially the ones that were doing that. And so the financial side isn't always on the producer side, but it is at some companies. And that's why I'm talking about it. But just be aware of, I would say that 50-50 or whatever of the companies do not have a producer doing any kind of financial work, budgets or things like that at some levels. But you probably are at some levels dealing with vendors and things like that and making sure everybody's getting paid. And again, just making sure everybody's happy. And so, but the reverse side of this also is that, there's going to be different stores you're dealing with and different things where not only do you have to like say put your game out on say Steam, but you also have to work on the legal contracts with Steam. You got to make sure that your team is going to do stuff that Steam wants or has to integrate in certain things for Steam to be happy. And then in the end, you have to handle all the stuff that's going to get uploaded to Steam. So you might be the guy actually like uploading the build to them. You have to work with like sales and marketing to make sure that there might be screenshots approved. And not only do you have to like take the screenshots. So quite often as a game producer, I'm actually the guy taking the screenshots, taking the videos, and then maybe working with a video editor or working with somebody, an artist, to touch them up or add a logo or whatever it is, on that thing. And then I'm also the one that's probably going to upload that video to Steam or to, a website. So we haven't even gotten into like marketing yet, but you're just dealing with all that and like just being the one that takes the screenshots, but you also got to get them approved. And so throughout this entire thing that we haven't really talked about is the approval process. And we'll get into that just in a second, but that just becomes another nightmare. But ultimately, again, like here with royalties and things like that, at some point, somebody like Steam also has to pay you. And then you have to also be managing that relationship and making sure that you're getting paid, making sure they don't owe you money, making sure the accounting department or whoever it is working, with them and stuff. And so there's a lot there that you have to work with, on both sides, both in spending money and in getting the money back. is something that you need to do there. Now, let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned just a minute ago, approvals. So another huge job of a producer typically is getting everything approved. Now, there can be a lot of levels of approvals depending on the type of game you're making. Now, the approvals could be things that are, the approvals could be internal, and they could be external. So, and this gets exponentially harder. For example, if you have a licensed product that you're doing. So let's just say you got a movie license, right? So you might.
This is a genus of Diplodocid.
Alexa, cancel.
Dinosaurs.
Oh, the joys of Alexa when she thinks she understands you. So you might have to then be working on. Let's say you're working with Warner Brothers. And, you're going to go to Warner Brothers and you've licensed some big movie that Warner Brothers puts out. And, all along the way, like every piece of art, every game build, like everything is going to have to be shown to them. So you may be doing that over video. You might just be sending them builds. You might be going in person, depending on what you're doing. And, but you have to be basically getting sign-offs either monthly or quarterly or however often you've established it from from that studio or that license holder. And then that can get even more complicated, that Warner Brothers might have certain approval rights. But I've also been in relationships where the movie director also had approval rights. The movie writer sometimes had movie approval rights. The actors can have movie approval right or game approval rights even. Like, how does the character look? Like, if you're going to have, the character in the game, like in James Bond, we had Pierce Brosnan in our game. And, we had to have his approval to make sure that his character looked acceptable in the game, and so at every step you could have voiceover, art, animations, everything might have somebody needing to approve it. And then on top of that, the ESRB and people like that are kind of an approval process. Your executive management team, need to approve it. Your sales and marketing team need to approve it. And so as a producer, you're basically working with anybody and everybody that has anything to do with the game that needs to have approvals. And so, and those approvals again could be coming, hopefully not daily, but these could be arriving weekly to monthly, and just making sure that all that stuff gets approved so everybody can move forward. And it could even be internal in your own team. So some producers also have to micromanage the creative leads. So for example, let's just say you have an art director and you have a bunch of artists under him. Like, I've had art directors who had, several hundred artists under them. And it was really tricky because those artists would generate a lot of art. And at some point, somebody somewhere has to make sure that that art is approved, even internally, so that the art director at some point is going to get buy off and say, like, okay, yeah, I like that character. I like that character. I like that character. And that's all approved. But that character, not so much. Let's change this, change this, change this. And that's kind of the role of an art director. But on some teams, that gets a little contentious. And the producers have to often step in and make sure the approvals are also being done within a timely manner, because people may be either moving on to something else or they're waiting or whatever. And again, the art director may be really busy, and I understand that, but if they don't make the right decisions, if they don't make the right approvals, that can really mess with the schedules and the team and stuff like that too. So approvals can be internal, but that's usually not as big of a problem. Generally, you can just have a quick meeting, everybody looks at it, and it kind of just moves forward. But do be aware that external approvals can take a long time, and they can be really, really hard. And so you do need to be aware that is a huge, huge, huge part of the game, and of what you do. And again, that kind of comes back to like legal and stuff, right? Where you're making sure that everything's being done that way. And one of the toughest things is that in some cases, if you're a small developer and you're working with a publisher, a big part of your job is as a small developer. Let's say you're the senior producer at a small, 50-person company, and you've signed a deal with, let's say, Microsoft, and you are doing an Xbox game for Microsoft. So one of the things there, we talked earlier when we were looking at the schedules about milestones. So one of the reasons that we use the term milestone versus month is that a milestone typically is a payment. And so a milestone is generally predetermined and figured out kind of ahead of time. It doesn't mean they can't change throughout the life cycle of a product, but you have a milestone, and basically you as a small developer, you work on the game for a period of time. You then deliver that milestone at the end of the month, typically, but that could be slowed down or changed. And then the milestones basically are, if they're approved, then they're paid. And so that process can be absolutely critical because, again, your company may not get its monthly check. And I've literally had cases where my employees did not get paid because, the publisher did not accept the milestone payment or did not accept the milestone. So there might have been a problem. Maybe something was missing. Maybe something wasn't up to the right quality level, whatever that case is. But you as a producer are the one managing that. And ultimately it's your job as a producer to make sure that everything is there and that everything is done. And if not, then you have to spin it, sell it, and try to wiggle your way to get them to approve it, even though it might not have checked every box, right? And so you have to negotiate that milestone submission. And so you need to be careful there, about that. You need to understand that the milestone submissions and that process, especially at a small developer, can kill you just because if you don't have a lot of money in the bank and you're waiting for that next payment to literally make payroll or whatever, if you don't get that milestone approved, you're in a lot of trouble. And so as a producer, you have to be very, very aware of that, especially at a small company, if your payments are getting tied to these milestones. And so that approval each month and that milestone delivery of each month could be critical to what you're doing. And in fact, on top of that, again, as a producer, you're often the guy who's uploading that information. You're the one putting it up on their websites, or you're sending them a disc, or you're whatever it is. But you're making sure, again, that like somebody in the dev team might need to do a build of whatever they're doing. Let's say if it's going to be a playable milestone, you might need to have a version of the game that they can load into their Xbox or whatever it is, or use on their development machines or their PC or their mobile phone. And so again, like as a producer, what needs to be done. You got to go to your engineering team and say like, hey guys, it's the end of the month again. I need a build, I need a special build that's fully playable and that's not broken, and doesn't completely crash or whatever. So you might even have to have another process in place. Like maybe they ship that milestone at 3 weeks instead of 4 weeks. And then you spend the last week bug fixing, polishing, optimizing. That's the way some teams work. Some of their processes are more about, instead of working up to the last minute, you kind of finish it at 3 weeks instead of 4. And then the last week is all bug fixing and optimization. And that helps ensure that the bill that you send out at the end of the month is going to be solid and stable. And it also has another helpful thing is that at the end of the year or whenever, when you get into like the beta phase, when you have a lot of bugs, if you've never really bug fixed along the way, suddenly you could literally have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bugs in your bug database, and then you're just overwhelmed. And so these are two different schools of thought. There's not a right or a wrong here, but understanding, like, do you fix along the way, at least partially, or do you wait to the very end and then try to fix everything? And both are kind of dangerous for a variety of reasons. But again, as a producer, your job is to get those builds, get them to the right people, get them approved, get paid for them, and even the approvals might need to have an email, a form, or something filled out from a legal perspective that says, I'm approving this milestone, right? And then even from a legal perspective, we had to do this with some publishers and some licensors that we even would say, like, if such and such is not approved within 30 days, it's automatically approved. So basically they have 30 days to make comments and they have 30 days to say yes or no. But basically at the end of that 30 days, if there's no response from them, and usually as a producer, I'd follow up at 20 days or whatever and say, hey guys, we're waiting for an approval. What do you think? And then if they still don't respond at 30 days, then legally it's then accepted, and you can move forward. Now, not every company has that clause or that contract. I always put that in there because I've had too many licensors, especially movie studios, just stall. I had one funny case where we had a game that was in production and we went all the way to like basically closed beta where we were ready to launch the game. I mean, we were probably 60 days out from finishing the game. So we were a good 16, 18 months in production with a movie based on a very famous movie. that was also in production. And we were basically ready to start manufacturing discs. It was a retail game, and we're ready to go into production. Not a single thing on the entire game had been approved yet, but we had not put in a clause for the automatic approval after 30 days. And oh my God, it was such a nightmare. And we literally were calling them 10 times a day going, guys, we need these approved. Like, we got to ship the game. And they were just ghosting us. Like this particular movie studio just was not, helping us at all. And so we literally were legally blocked. We could not ship the game. And so ultimately we had to play politics, and it was kind of funny. We had somebody we knew that was high up on their board, and ended up calling this big meeting, and that person yelled at them and then basically just looked at them and said, everything's approved, right? And they kind of all sheepishly were scared, and they kind of said, yeah, it's all approved, and so we got everything approved in one meeting without them even looking at it. They just were, they didn't really care. But again, that's half the trouble. And speaking of that, actually, just as another side note, a lot of our jobs as producers are, as we like to jokingly say, herding cats. So a lot of that is just, again, juggling a million things, and you're keeping it all going. But you're keeping people aligned. You're making sure they're getting their stuff done, that they're not slacking off, that they're, it's this delicate balance. So your people management skills, your soft skills, are absolutely critical, and probably some of the most important skills you can have as a game producer. And so you need to be kind of aware of that. And, and next, you've got to, make sure that, you're also deep in the throes of politics. And that's a horrible, ugly word. It scares me to death. I get nightmares about politics. I don't like politics, but it's a necessary evil. Now, if you're just a game designer or just an artist or just an engineer, you probably will maybe occasionally have some politics. Maybe occasionally, like, somebody will, act up or be toxic or give you problems or whatever, right? That's just human nature, and that those things do exist. But as a producer, depending on your company, your job can be almost all politics or very, very, very politically heavy. And that comes back to these approval processes. It comes back to, resources. Like, a good example, when I was at EA one time, we were trying to staff up a new game, and we needed about, I think at the time, about 100, 120 employees, new hires to fill out this pretty big game we were trying to make. And we were trying for months and months and months to hire for that job role, and not a single person came in. And we kept making offers to people, and they weren't coming in. And this particular studio at EA had multiple projects in development. We were not the number one project within the studio. We were kind of number 2 or number 3, and probably the bastard stepchild at best. And so, with that project, we kept trying to hire, and this went on for so many months, and we just couldn't get anybody. So we were falling farther and farther and farther behind schedule, and basically kind of in danger of getting canceled because we couldn't hire. And what we finally figured out was going on was that other team, which was the number 1 team, was also having trouble hiring. And there's just, sometimes it's really hard in our industry. There's often a lot of job shortages. I think even today, there's still a lot of job shortages. And so for all of you that are still in school or thinking about coming to CG Spectrum, there's huge opportunities in the game industry. Whether you're an artist, a designer, engineer, producer, whatever, there's still great opportunities here as a company, as an industry. And so, so with that, you need to, sometimes fight dirty or play dirty a little bit. And so in this particular case, as a producer, I was fighting politics. The politics was who gets to get the good people, who gets to have those people. And I would literally go to HR. I'd make an offer to somebody after interviewing them, and then they never showed up. And then eventually I started seeing those same people in the studio, like in other places. And I was like, dude, like, what happened? Like, I hired you, or I made an offer. And they said, oh no, HR, did a different offer, and they hired me for the other project. And so I found out, like, literally like 50 people that we tried to hire had all, been sent over to this other project, and none of them came my way. And so it was great for that project. I understand that was the number 1 project, but me as the producer, it's on my shoulders to make sure that my project gets done on time and on budget. And so that can be, really tricky. And so I had to go to, like, my boss, the VP that was kind of up there, and I told him what was going on. And he was like, tell you what, you just start hiring people and don't even go through HR. Like you have my approval to like literally just start putting out offers and get them in the door, get them in the room, get them literally sitting at their desk. And then we're going to tell HR that we hired them, and so we literally had to go around HR. Oh my God, I got in so much trouble, but I mean, I was protected. I had the VP that told me to do that and he was protecting me, but I got yelled at for that one quite a bit. But that was the only way we kept our project alive is again, it was all politics and yeah, HR, not the group I really want to piss off, but it was that or die. I mean, because literally it was going to kill our project if we didn't do that. And so, so that's a small story about politics and then just how as a producer, sometimes you have to navigate those minefields. But in the end, your job is about your project and your team, right? And so as a producer, you need to keep your team happy. You need to keep them on time and on budget. You need to keep your project on time and on budget, and you just have to understand that, managing people, herding these cats, as they say, is a big part of that job. But you need to be a human being, right? And so part of that delicate balance as a producer is how do I be a human being, but also be a manager, a boss, and be that guy that keeps them on track, on time and on budget. And I think our industry is very notorious, with crunch modes and bad, problems. There's lots and lots and lots of stories out there about, so many teams that have had issues with abusing their employees, working them too hard to, whatever that is. There's lots and lots of stories of that. And now the producers are not always at fault there, but it is the producer ultimately who is that guy who's kind of like, he needs to be able to manage his project well. He needs to be able to say like, this is, how hard we're going to work, how long we're going to work, and to not burn out your team. And this can be sometimes indirect, and this is where the politics again comes in. Like upper management may be saying, get this done on time or else. And if the only way to do that is to work 80 hours a week instead of 40, as a producer, like, what do you do? Because you may not have the budget to do it another way. So this is where it gets really tricky, right? And so I'd say that's one of the hardest jobs of being a producer. Out of the 100 jobs I've just mentioned, one of the hardest is just in that scheduling side and that resource management side. It's all interrelated, right? So it's how many people do I have? Who do I have when? How long do I have them for, each day? How many man hours per day are they productive? What the budget for those people is and so on and so forth, right? So there's this big circle of all these things that are kind of interrelated because if I had more budget, then I can hire more people. And, so like, let's just say we have to get, 100 man days of work done in 10 days and I have 10 people, then I can do that, 10 people at 10 days each. That's 100 man days. No problem. If I only have 5 people, then I can only get 50 man days done. So therefore, I'm only going to get half the work done in the time that's allocated. So I have 2 choices. I can either hire 5 more people, and therefore my budget's going to increase 5x or whatever, basically doubling for that particular thing. I'm doubling the budget. I went from 5 people to 10 people. So that just doubled my budget right there. Now, maybe I've got buffer in my budget. And that's, again, as a producer, I'm trying to always put in buffers everywhere from schedules to budgets, everything. I always want to have a little excess just in case, because when things are going to go bad, not if, but when things go bad, I need to be able to compensate for that. And so again, but the other option is I have those 5 people, instead of hiring 5 more, I can work those people twice as many hours. And so therefore I'm going to get, the 100 man days done by working everybody 80 hours a week instead of 40. But now I've got, 5 pissed off people that are also burned out, so what's the cost, right? And that's one of the hard things to help manage. Anyhow, you guys have been super quiet. Does anybody have any questions? We got 5 minutes left. I want to make sure that, that this has been helpful to you guys. I hope that this has been something that's, kind of, opened your eyes a little bit to just kind of the reality of being a producer and kind of, what it's like to be a producer. I find that being a producer is a super exciting job, and a lot of fun because you get to wear a lot of hats. So it's, again, that jack of all trades type job, which some people really love and, and some people hate. But again, as a producer, if you guys are artists right now, or you guys are engineers, or you guys are designers, there is definitely opportunity to become a producer. So you could be an artist for 20 years and then decide like, hey, I want to step out of actual art production and become, a global producer, meaning for the whole game, or just an art producer that just handles the art team and the art tasks and the art stuff. Whatever the case is, there's great opportunity for you to transition, whether it's now or later in life, to be a producer. But keep in mind that the more you understand what a producer does and understand how complicated their job is, I do believe that as an individual, you can, oh, no worries, Kitty. It's all right. I just want to make sure you're not being quiet or didn't have anything else to ask. But again, being a producer can be a fun role for a lot of people. And lastly, the thing I didn't talk about much, but the last thing I'll mention in the last 2 minutes is the last job that I'll talk about is sales and marketing. And so you're also the liaison between sales and marketing. That's also a big part of your job, and making sure how is the game going to get sold? How is it marketing? And you're also like the liaison that's going to get assets, for example. So you might be, working with your team to get screenshots, to get videos, promotional material, logos, the box, manuals, things for the Apple website or the website itself, the microsites, whatever it is. There's a ton of material that has to get created. And quite often that's either created by your team or by a marketing team. And either way, there's approvals needed, on both sides. So if the marketing team creates a poster, your team, you're maybe executive producer or somebody might need to approve that to make sure that what the marketing team is putting out is good, so on and so forth. And so it's kind of one of those things, that, I think, Kitty, you're saying pre-order merchandise. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff there where, you could be working on, all that kind of stuff, all that sales and marketing things. Like, do you have t-shirts available? Do you have, stuff on the website? And even once it goes to live operations, there's a whole nother side of being a producer and a live operations stuff. So I'll show you really quick. I co-authored and helped write this one game, this book called Producing Games. I think it's still available on Amazon. But if you're interested in kind of learning a little bit more about it, I kind of did the initial book, and I had a couple friends of mine help finish it. It's not super thick, but it definitely is a good starting place to learn more about producing games. So, but there's other books out there. There's lots of other resources, but if you're interested in that, definitely check it out. And otherwise, next week, again, we're going to be talking about game production and kind of, which is going to be related to today's topic, but really a step back on how games are made from start to finish, processes, pipelines, things like that, and kind of give you guys a better start to finish understanding of how a game is made. And then kind of the different, people that are involved and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be next week's. So anyways, thank you all for joining. I appreciate your time. And I hope that you guys learned a little bit for this. Thank you, Kitty. I always appreciate you're one of my rock steady people that are here every week. So I really do appreciate that. And again, hopefully this week's topics were as useful to you, and will. I'm sure you do, Kitty, but it's all right. We appreciate you spending part of your life with me and with us at CG Spectrum. So anyhow, thanks again, everybody, and have a great week, and be safe.